we're Sunday the 29th of September. This is Tony Curzon Price with another Open Democracy podcast. And I'm here with Georgios Varouxakis, who is a Mill scholar. Hello, Georgios.
Hello.
And Georgios has just written a book called Liberty Abroad, J.S. Mill on International Relations. Georgios is a Mill scholar, and the book is a treasure trove of historical detail and analysis of Mill's writings on this most important of subjects, which is what does philosophy, what does utilitarianism have to say about the way in which nations should behave towards each other. Just as by brief way of introduction, I'm sure that many listeners will know Mill really only from a few key texts that have been turned into standalone philosophical icons: utilitarianism, liberty, maybe political economy. But you take a rather different approach to Mill and his work. Can you tell us a little bit about the approach you take in the book?
Yes, it is an attempt, while analyzing the theoretical positions that Mill took themselves, to interpret them and see exactly what he meant, and sometimes to clarify what might seem contradictions or incoherencies or changes of mind or whatever, through looking at the context, through looking at what his intentions were, what his reception was, how what he wrote was perceived, how it affected particular debates during his time, how he may have changed public opinion, or may have prevented a war, or may have led the movement in favor of a particular side in the American Civil War. So that is the major contribution I tried to make, which involves a lot of historical research, not just on what he wrote, but much more on what others wrote.
I have to say that the research and the context is itself absolutely fascinating. This is mid to late 19th century. It's London is the centre of of the world power, and Mill is a public intellectual.
Yes, exactly. The context is fascinating because Britain was the greatest power that had ever been. Since Rome, no power had achieved such an empire, and Britain's was larger than Rome's. So the question was, what do you do with it? What can you do about the world? Is it a good thing for the world or not? And Mill did have strong views on it. What is for us, retrospectively, I suppose, also important and interesting is that Mill is the paradigmatic liberal. He's the prophet of liberalism. If you have to choose, in the way Marx is the leading socialist thinker, you would say Mill is the leading liberal. So that's why his work has attracted a lot of attention, because people want to flesh out what liberalism has to say about international relations.
So I have to say, reading the book, I often thought about the London that you describe and Washington today, and one thinks, yes, these questions that seem to be questions of abstract philosophy as often presented are actually terribly practical questions for someone involved in influencing the decisions of a world power.
Exactly, yes. And the thing, of course, that you are raising is the difference between Mill then and a political theorist or philosopher today would be that the vast majority of political theorists or philosophers today, even the most distinguished, would be academics who would be writing in an academic context for other academics in a specialized jargon. Some of them are public intellectuals. They would try to address a broader public, but it is less pronounced than it used to be. Whereas Mill was much more engaged. He was not an academic. He was working for the East India Company, very interestingly. He was a kind of public servant, although it was semi-public.
The equivalent maybe of one of the defense contractors in Iraq today, maybe.
Well, that is a provocative way of opening that question. Yes, and I think we have to go to that question soon. What exactly his career was and how it was affecting his views on India is a major controversial issue and extremely interesting issue, which I address in the book head on. But he was very engaged in political debates. He was what we would call today an intellectual. In those days, the word didn't exist, of course. He was a member of parliament for 3 years for the Liberals, and he was very explicit that he joined parliament when he was asked in order to promote his views and make them more public, not least his very controversial and very strong views on women's equality, on giving all equal rights and votes to women.
And even when he's not in parliament, one of the things that you make clear is that is the politicking he does. He's involved in political campaigns all the time. He is a conduit to the highest levels of decision, to Gladstone, and people know that getting Mill on your side and making an argument that he accepts, making him think about a particular problem, is a way of gaining influence in Britain and in the Empire.
Yes, it's a fascinating story in the sense he was most of his life seen as extreme and too radical and unorthodox and all that, even by mainstream liberals. And yet he had achieved by the 50s, by the 1850s and even more 60s, such a preeminence intellectually as a thinker, as the author of a major book on the history on political economy and a major book on logic, which became standard textbooks in Cambridge and in the other universities, that you couldn't ignore Mill. So when Mill was raising his voice on an issue like the American Civil War, it did make a difference. It did make a difference when he decided to be one of the leaders of the pro-North campaign, which I discuss in the book briefly, and I have discussed it elsewhere in an article more recently. And that's one of the many campaigns.
Why not dive into the heart of the subject with the American Civil War? It's one of the, in a sense, one of the extremely good judgment calls that Mill makes. And firstly, he is absolutely steadfastly against slavery in the South.
Yes.
And yet, there's something also quite calculating. He supports an absolute defeat. He wants to take the war right to the end. Can you explain to us what it is that makes him want that crushing defeat of the South?
Yes. It's actually fascinating, and if one doesn't look at it in its whole context, one might see Mill as a hawkish, pro-war person who just loves war, which was not the case. And as you will have seen in the rest of the book, he undertook very controversial campaigns to prevent a war from happening or to stop a war. But he thought he was not a pacifist. He thought sometimes war is inevitable, and sometimes you have to go to war. And his most striking statements about war are on the occasion of the American Civil War. So when the confrontation started with the secession of the South and with the North wanting to preserve the Union, Mill immediately knew and had predicted 10 years before, by the way, that the confrontation was coming. In an article attacking Carlyle's racist views, in a provocative article Carlyle called The Nigger Question, Mill had already written that the confrontation is coming and Carlyle is doing the world of the devil, because people like Carlyle are extremely popular and important in America. So the Southern propagandists are going to publicize your views about the inferiority of the blacks, and you're going to do an awful lot of damage. So this was 1850, more than a decade before the Civil War. So what I'm trying to say is the Civil War, Mill had predicted that the confrontation will come, and he knew what was at stake. What was at stake was the extension of slavery to the territories, which would then later become states, and therefore the Southern lobby would prevail in the politics of the whole Union and would always take care of its interests. His Irish friend had proved through political economic arguments how slavery needed to expand because it was exhausting the soil. So it was going to disappear if it didn't expand. So for Mill and his friends, the Civil War was not about preserving the Union. It was not about the right of self-determination of the poor southern states. It was slave owners knowing that it's a condition of their continued existence that they had to expand and extend slavery to the territories westwards, which would mean the whole of the United States would be dominated by slave-holding states because they would get rights in Congress.
I was struck by one of the things that you write and quote Mill as saying on the need for absolute defeat, as well as the issues specific to slavery. You say, and I quote you, Mill spoke of, this is a quote from Mill, the salutary shock that the American mind is now undergoing, which would have a tendency to correct some of the many great faults in the working of democratic institutions in America. The thing, of course, you've explained some of the detail of that, about how the South would keep its grip on the politics of the nation. But I'm interested in his use of the word the American mind there. Yes. In several points in your book, it seems that Mill has a civilizational view of nations. Yes. It seems rather odd for someone who is iconically the radical individualist. Can you explain how civilizational thinking figures in Mill's thinking about the history he's living through?
Yes, I'd love to, but shall we finish with the slavery?
Go on.
That is, in the American case, I think the way I interpret him, Mill thought, given that it started, it will also have as a side effect the salutary consequences, results on the American national character. It will stir up the waters and prevent America from becoming a mass society of consumers who somehow don't care about anything and so on. But that was a side effect. He wouldn't have started a war in order to stir up the national character. There are thinkers in the history of political thought who would have done that, including Tocqueville, who writes about the salutary effects of war on the national character in his famous Democracy in America. Mill had a serious falling out with Tocqueville in 1840 exactly on this issue, because Tocqueville thought that France should go to war with Britain on an issue of honor and pride, just because the French were becoming torpidly individualistic and materialistic, and they needed to aspire to gloire and grandeur, and a war would be exactly the thing needed. Mill disapproves of that.
So this is an argument we heard a lot with Iraq as well. I mean, it was one of the favourite neoconservative arguments, wasn't it? That actually war strengthens the fibre of the nation.
Yes. But Mill would be absolutely abhorred at the idea that you start a war just to achieve that. So in America, the idea was, incidentally, this war will also have this salutary effect for the next generation, that it will wake up the American mind and stir it up and avoid the torpor that a democracy is likely to, and a prosperous democracy is most likely to fall into eventually. But the main reason why, I'm coming back to what you raised from the beginning, why Mill not only was in favor of the North winning, but he was insistent the war has to become absolutely bitter and has to last long. If it doesn't last long, it will lead to a compromise that will preserve slavery intact in some form or other. And he didn't want that. He thought an institution like slavery is so inhuman, is so unacceptable, it's so backward, is so atavistic, is so beyond the pale unacceptable, basically, for various reasons we can discuss, that here is an opportunity to erase it. You have to take it. And he thought the North was bound to compromise, because the North had not started the war in order to abolish slavery. The North had started the war officially in order to preserve the Union. We know now through historical work that Lincoln himself, his mind developed. As the war was becoming more and more bitter, so Lincoln was becoming more and more bitterly opposed to slavery. So Mill was right that a compromise would have been reached if it hadn't become so bitter. Unfortunately, of course, it means an awful lot of lives were lost. But he thought the argument of Mill, as of Lincoln later in the last years, of course, would be all these lives that have been lost already would go wasted if that institution is preserved. So for it to become a war of principle, an anti-slavery war, it has to become bitter, it has to last long, and then it will become a war of principle as opposed to just a war to preserve the Union, which in Britain many people misinterpreted as being an imperialistic adventure of the North to enslave the poor South. The Southern states had the right of self-determination. That's how the majority of people here would see it, and the propagandists of the South would present it to the British public. So Mill played, it was his, as I say in the book, his finest hour, because he saw from the beginning what it was about. He foresaw the outcome. He foresaw the exact timing. If it lasts until the summer of 1862, he said, it will become much more bitter and they will start talking about slavery. And it was in September 1862 that Lincoln made the the provisional Emancipation Proclamation.
Let me now get you onto the segue question, which was the question about Mill's. How does Mill think about the character of civilizations or the character of nations? It's one of the things that I was very struck with in the book is the whole. I kept asking myself, is this Mill the universalist, individualist, utilitarian that we know from the iconic books, or is this a Mill who thinks in terms of nations, their characters, their interests, etc.?
Mill believed that nationality is a good thing instrumentally, in the sense some degree of shared culture, shared expectation, shared language and literature is what enables a society to live together and builds the kind of trust and cohesion and solidarity that you need in a society. It's an argument that many people today make, and sometimes they make it as an argument in favor of the welfare state. There are people today who say, how can you keep a welfare state among strangers, among people who feel they have nothing?
David Goodhart being...
Yes, and before that, the political theorist David Miller published a book on nationality in 1995, where he made this argument exactly from the point of view of the left or social democratic principles. So Mill, but he insisted it has no intrinsic value, nationality. It's only an instrumental thing. It's a means towards whatever ends he was pursuing, which is the happiness of people.
So as you tell the story, and you tell it briefly here, several things struck me. Firstly, you say that he says representative government is not possible in a country formed of different nationalities.
Yes.
I mean, that seems like a very strong statement.
Yes. Yes.
That impossibility comes from the fact, of the inability to form a general will if you're of different nationalities?
That's a very good question. I think he says almost impossible. So there's always hope. But the argument was, if you have a multinational state like the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire in his days, where the various nationalities have national aspirations and hate each other. It's another thing if they have merged together and they live harmoniously. But if you have national aspirations and these groups are divided by national hatreds, speak different languages, read different newspapers, form different publics, speak in a different agora, a different forum in Mill's vocabulary, then the problem is the government finds it very easy to play them one against each other, against the other. And the government will send, as he says somewhere, Italian troops to suppress the Hungarian Revolution, and it's Hungarian troops to suppress the Italian Revolution, and it's Croatians to suppress some other revolution somewhere else in the empire, and so on. So you don't have the solidarity, the feeling we are one people, and you don't have soldiers who feel they will not kill the people if the government tells them, because they are the same people. So he thought that's what complicates things. He strongly believed, and this is what emerges. So this is something I just mentioned in my book because I refer to my earlier work, but something that proves it again, how strongly he felt about the importance of having a common agora, a common forum, a common debate, is the colonies chapter, the settlement colonies, where he believed you cannot have one state between Britons and New Zealanders and Australians, no matter how they speak the same language and they are of the same descent and so on, because once people live so far away from each other, they develop different characters. They see the sun on different days from different aspects, from different sides. They have different neighbors. As John Morley, a follower of Mill, said sometime later in the 1880s, why should Australians bother about the neutrality of Belgium?
I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Georgios Varouxakis. It continues in parts 2 and 3 on opendemocracy.net. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Tedworth Trust, who's made these podcasts possible.